there! Thank you so much for tuning into our education video this week. My name is Maggie.
And I'm Amelia.
And we are the educators here at Hawks Aloft. Good girl. So today we are continuing our discussion all about feathers by talking about feather growth. Here to help us with feather growth is our two feathered friends, Indigo Crow and Idaho. So these two birds are going to talk about feather growth with me. Let's talk about Idaho's story. She has an interesting story because she is non-releasable due to her feather growth. She does not grow quality enough feathers to sustain long-distance flight. Yeah, that's because she was exposed to industrial chemical runoff when she was a nestling. And as a Swainson's hawk, she would really need long-distance flight, as they take one of the longest migrations of all American raptors. So let's go back to how feathers grow. Yeah, feathers on a bird are arranged in specific patterns or tracks. The specific patterns or tracks that grow are called terralae. There are also areas of a bird's body that are intentionally bald, such as a raptor's feet and their shear around their beak. The areas where there are no feather growths are called aterralae. So each feather grows from a feather follicle in the skin, which can be seen externally as a small bump of skin called the papilla. Proteins are laid down around the surface of this bump of skin to develop a feather structure. This is also where the branching patterns of a feather form. You can see that in number 2. The smaller branches fuse at the base to make the thicker ones. So barbules fuse into barbs and barbs fuse into rachis. As a feather matures, the tips get pushed away from the feather follicle. And so just like a human's hair, the oldest parts of the feather are at the leading end, and the youngest parts of the feather are at the base. So as the feather grows, it stays curled in a tubular shape when it pushes away from the skin. This stage, as you can see in 3 and 4, are called pin feathers, or sometimes known as blood feathers. Pin feathers are sensitive and can bleed a lot if bumped during growth. That's because they have a live blood supply that nourishes that growing feather. Once the feather has grown enough, the keratin cylinder shape starts to dissolve at the end, and the feathers usually get help from their bird by preening to open up that keratin sheath. Once a feather unfurls, its interlocking structures are totally formed, and birds maintain their mature feathers by preening them. So feather growth is much quicker than hair growth on mammals. This helps the birds survive. If you think about it, many species of birds go from small, tiny, downy chicks to fully flighted birds in a matter of weeks. So their feather growth is super rapid compared to mammal hair. Let's move to Amelia and we'll talk more about molting of feathers.
All right, so first I want to go ahead and introduce Indigo Crow. You may remember her. She's our American crow, and she came to us because she was kept illegally as a pet. And what happened was she was fed an improper diet and kept in a small cage, and she developed metabolic bone disease. And because of that, she has poor feather quality sometimes and some other health issues as well. Now, all species of birds molt, but all of them have different patterns depending on their needs. Molting is important because it replaces old, worn out, and damaged feathers. And some birds molt because of seasonal changes, so they'll grow extra downy feathers in the winter, and then they'll molt them when the weather warms up. And some birds molt due to hormonal changes, so they will grow special breeding feathers and then molt those after the breeding season ends. Molting is very energy intensive, so it's important that they do molting outside of their breeding season and their migration. And it's also important that molting does not disrupt their survival in any way. So when they molt their feathers, they actually will molt them in specific patterns so as not to disrupt their balance when they're in flight. Now, some birds take more than a year to molt all of their feathers, but more typical is birds that will molt their feathers annually. And some birds, like duck species, will lose all of their flight feathers at once, leaving them flightless on the ground for about 2 weeks while they regrow more of their feathers back in. Now, birds that grow feathers annually within a few weeks or months might be some hawk species, some woodpeckers, flycatchers, and hummingbirds. There are some birds that have one full molt every year and then a special molt during breeding season, so birds like tanagers and warblers. And then there are a handful of species that have 2 complete molts every year. Species like the marsh wren or the bobolink, that I have shown here, live in very harsh environments, and because of that, they sustain a lot of feather damage. So they actually replace all of their feathers twice a year, which is amazing. So if all birds molt, then what do we do with the molted feathers from our education birds? So due to the Migratory Bird Species Act, we can keep a few of those feathers for education purposes, and we keep a few feathers that we use in imping on some rescue birds. Imping is where we take naturally molted feathers from another bird and attach it to a broken feather on one of rescue birds, so that they can then go be released into the wild, and then they'll naturally molt that broken feather, but they'll be able to survive in the meantime. So the rest of our feathers go to a feather repository, and we use the non-eagle feather repository called Liberty Wildlife in Phoenix, Colorado. Phoenix, Arizona. So any eagle feathers that we might gather are going to be sent to the Eagle Feather Repository in Denver, Colorado. And what happens once they make their way to the repositories is that they are then sent to Native American tribes throughout the country to be used in their ceremonies. This helps to prevent people from poaching birds to get their feathers, and it gives places like Hawks Aloft a place to send their education birds' molted feathers. Thank you so much for joining us with this video this week. We are wrapping up our feather talk, and we'll begin a new topic next week. Let us know if you have any questions, and we will see you next time.